When we look at the text that we have for today, it's a good example about how Holy Week does not give us enough worship opportunities to pack in the readings that belong in Holy Week. And so this is kind of one of the sequences. We know the story of the Last Supper. This one, the other supper, is not as well known. And we know the story, right? But it's not something that if we read it in September, I think most of us wouldn't even blink. But it's associated to this same tight schedule. And there's a lot going on in the story. Elizabeth was touching on some of the elements. But I want to take a look at this in a little more detail because there are some things in it that one wouldn't expect. We would imagine a home that was probably regular size, probably not super huge. We would imagine that if Lazarus is having Jesus over for dinner, we would imagine Judas is referenced, and so others would be brought into the house. We would imagine a crowded scene, not certainly a COVID-safe environment, probably beyond fire marshal capacity kind of situation. There are other things about the John version of this text that we have today that I think are worth mentioning just as a quick footnote to the text today. Of the four gospel writers, John's is written latest, a full generation, maybe even two, beyond the time frame of the events that are happening. And there's somebody in this text specifically who is not in the other ones. Now, you might think of, well, I mean, of course Jesus is in it, right? Jesus is in all the stories. But other people are not. There's a disagreement as to whose home it is, which if you've ever been to a family reunion and there's a story being shared of something that happened back in great-grandpa's day, and you've got some of the cousins are arguing that it happened at a Thanksgiving dinner at Aunt Jody's house when in fact it was Easter at Uncle John's house, but the story is still the same, right? We have the same story. That's a little bit of what's going on here. But the person who is mentioned who's not otherwise is Judas. Judas is mentioned. And do you notice in the text he gets a fair amount of real estate too? He's a mean guy who's not very generous, but let me go on at length about how mean he is. He's the one who kept all the money and liked to steal from it. It's interesting that this text doesn't show up in the earlier gospel accounts. The further we get away from 30 AD in the events that are actually recorded in Scripture, the story of Judas gets inflated and inflated and inflated and inflated. This is not all of the story, but is some of the seeds of anti-Semitism that creep into Christianity at certain chapters of the story. And I think it's worth mentioning it out loud since he gets so much real estate in this text. So that's a little footnote to park over here as we go into the rest of the text. Crowded house. There's a mixed sense of why they're there. Are they celebrating because Lazarus has come back from the dead? Is it that it's dinner and you got to eat dinner somewhere, right? Or what is the sense of things? Anywhere Jesus went in most of his ministry, up to this point in particular, it was probably a celebration of some kind, whether it be a religious observance or getting people together that you don't normally see, but an opportunity to gather with a large group. It's a mixed group. There are women present, men. We have the sense that it goes beyond the initial 12, just from those descriptions there. There's a lot going on in this. And in the midst of all of this, one other thing I should mention, they wouldn't have all been sitting at high, straight chairs at a table like we would have been, which is an important part for what comes later. In the midst of all of this, we have Martha and we have Mary. Martha was serving. You know, she only gets a fraction of the real estate that Judas does in the story. Think of all that takes place to make community, to make family, to make celebrations and meals, the gathering together of people happen. It is an endless list. Many, if not all of you, can be thinking of the kinds of things that have been on those lists, things that have probably been, in many cases, almost the same since the beginning of time. Who's getting the food? How are we getting the food? Who's cooking the food? Who's preparing this? We can imagine Martha in the thick of all of this, trying to discern how this is going to be accomplished. This sense of service for the sake of the community, the family that is gathered in that place in general. Jesus is in the midst of that, but it's broader than that in some ways. Then we have the story of Mary and her serving. And it's a strange story. I'm not an expert on nard, other than the fact that it sounds expensive. She's got a whole pound of it, which is a lot. We might today, it says 300 denarii. You might think in Jesus' day, that would be a year's worth of labor, the wages. We think of a day laborer or somebody in a not skilled position. I mean, $40,000, $50,000 worth of perfume in one bottle. It gets cracked open, right? And the fragrance of it filled the house. I think it knocked people over cold, is what I'm thinking. Fragrance of it filled the house. One time, when I was a counselor at Mount Cross, I had middle school boys in my cabin, and I had to send them up to the cabin after campfire because I needed to coordinate with the summer program director for a minute. Was chatting, went up to the cabin, and suddenly, when I stepped into the door, my eyes immediately started to water. And I couldn't figure out what had happened. I kind of stumbled through the cabin. I heard a lot of noise. I opened the back door of the cabin to get a draft through the space until I could understand what had happened. What had happened was that there was what we called, I don't know what these are called, but we called them mosquito hawks. They look like these oversized mosquitoes. The boys had found one in the cabin and thought this was a mosquito that was like gonna take your soul or something. And they had gotten excited. And being proper California kids, they'd never seen a mosquito in their lives, didn't know what bug repellent was, nothing like that. So all of them showed up with brand new cans, unopened, of bug repellent, right? And had each of them unloaded the entire canister in this cabin meant for the 10 of us. You noticed it on your first step into the room. It was overpowering. They couldn't understand why the repellent hadn't killed the insect. I had to explain to them, we love the mosquito hawk. Any rate. When the perfume gets opened, we can imagine in that part of the world that a meal shared in that space would have had a certain aroma, something spicy, something good, something that would be inviting you in as a part of it, and suddenly it is completely eclipsed by something that at maybe a first whiff smelled beautiful, and then a half a second later was too much in that space, right? Overwhelming. And then in the midst of that, what happens? It's not a sitcom where something gets bumped off a shelf and breaks and everybody laughs. She anoints Jesus' feet, which is very... Do you notice how we lose in our modern hearing of these texts the scandal of what's going on? We all just kind of say, oh yeah, she put it on his feet and wiped it off with her hair. That's bizarre. It's bizarre. It is intimate to the point of being awkward. You can imagine those around them being like, trying not to look. This very strange and intimate situation. We have Martha in the background trying to recover the meal in some fashion, and we have Mary who has stepped into that social context in a way that is causing everyone to feel very, very awkward. Now, In the midst of this, then, Judas jumps in with his piece. 300 denarii, that's very expensive. This woman bought $40,000 to $50,000 worth of perfume and brought it. Who buys $40,000 to $50,000? Who is this woman? There's all kinds of curious cultural cues in this text. But Jesus says something interesting. To the objections, he says, look, you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me, which feels awkward to our ears. It's kind of like, Jesus, don't you know we are always and only supposed to be focused on the poor? Who do you think you are anyway? He's Jesus, right? That's the sense of things. In the life of the church, historically, we've wrestled with this a bit. We could worship in a space that maybe looks a bit like Safeway or a classroom over here or something super simple, but instead, this space was built. And those who came before us put their resources together to accomplish this space. And there might have been comments at the time to say, hey, you could have gotten 300 denarii for this. What were you thinking? It seems to me that one of the things that Mary sees is the truth of the moment. The truth of the moment. In the gathering for this meal, I doubt that the invitation was, we'd like you to come over to our house. We're observing the final moments of Jesus' life before he's killed. That probably was not the invitation. But Mary knew. Mary knew what was happening. Mary had a clarity in the moment, an ability to focus at that time on Christ in a way that no one else in the room perhaps was willing to acknowledge, didn't want to pay attention to, but was aware of the moment. So where do we sit as Christians when we gather? Are we every week busting open $40,000 jars of perfume? Probably not. That would be overpowering even in this very well-ventilated space. But there is this two visions of serving that I would argue are intended to be complementary. There is the Martha sense of service, this sense of serving others and serving the community, especially those who are hungry and poor. And then there is Mary and her sense of service to Christ personally. In the life of the Christian community, when we gather for worship on Sundays, we gather in this space to do worship. Worship is a verb. It's something that we do. As I heard one professor comment, worship has an audience of one. We gather and participate in the liturgy. Liturgy literally means work of the people. It is something that we do together for the sake of God, for the sake of Christ. In some ways, our gathering every week in this space to worship God is Mary's style of service. But then at the end of the service, when we say, go in peace, serve the Lord, and walk out and move back into our regular rhythms of the week, that is where we are doing Martha's style of service, keeping our hearts, eyes, and ears open for the poor, the hungry, those at the margins, those who are hurting, those who are sick, those who are vulnerable. It is both of these things. The extravagance of this time together worshiping God, like Mary, and the sacrificial service, like Martha, for the sake of the community and the world. Amen.